little bit of background. Ciena started with ODL on the Wayback Machine, and we shifted our investment to Onos in 2015. As we shifted our investment over to Onos, we also shifted our investment over to look at Cord when it came up. And if you go back in the Git logs, you'll actually see some Ciena people way back in the original check-ins of Cord. One of the things that hit me about Cord right away was the leaf spine fabric. It was a nice, allowing dynamic network sizing, of course. And when I looked at the overall technology in Cord, it was one of the things that drew my attention. It said, look, of all the technologies that are going to probably impact the industry, this is the one that we got to really focus on, and it's going to be very important. I think one of the problems we've run into is, while it's been a very interesting technology, the number of people and investment in terms of resources in developing it has been very small. And I think that imbalance needs to change. And one of the problems, and I'll go into that a little bit later, is in terms of troubleshooting, in terms of finding help when you need it. It's hard because there's few people that can really get it. And there needs to be more, because then we can improve the overall quality of Trellis. When we started out with this, and some of this is still true today, the issue was you have to do a lot of manual configuration of Trellis. And not only manual configuration, you have to understand what the different objects in the configuration mean, right? There's a lot of detail there that you have to pull out, and you have to map it to the hardware and get these hardware attributes and put them in the right spot in the configuration. And then you have to push that configuration to Onos, and then you might have to restart the segment routing in Onos. And it was this process of using Trellis and getting the actual leaf spine fabric up and running, which was problematic. I really wanted the fabric just to be there. To be honest, I didn't want to work on the fabric. I just wanted it to be there. I wanted to leverage its capabilities, but not have to deal with it. And in the infancy, in particular, you really had to understand it, and you really had to do a lot of restarts. And when I say Trellis here, I'm not just referring to the Onos app and segment routing. I'm referring to the OFDPA and the switches and everything. It was this huge cycle of stop, reboot everything, and move on again, and hope the next thing worked. And it was problematic for us. As we matured with our experience with Trellis, we developed a container. We, Ciena, developed a container to help with some of this. And this was a configuration generator container that actually still exists today, though I don't think it's really used much. And basically what it did is it went off and connected to Onos and pulled a lot of the information you need for the Trellis configuration out of Onos. Devices, MAC addresses, IP information, and it would build that configuration. There were some problems with that, partially because you can generate a configuration, but when you push it to Onos, doesn't mean Onos, the segment routing app, would always take it. Again, you might have to restart the app. There were other issues around it, such that you wanted the information about hosts at this time, the IPs and the MACs. Unfortunately, Onos doesn't know about a host until that host has pinged it. So if you're looking at a reboot situation, in order to generate the configuration, you still had to go to every host behind a leaf and say, hey, ping through your fabric interface so that Onos will know about you, so that I can generate the configuration, so then I can push it to Onos, and then I can restart. Again, a very heavy process, not something that was conducive to getting the Trellis up and running quickly and consistently. As I hinted before, the configuration generator aged, and while it was used, it got quickly outdated. We ran into some issues with Trellis as the configuration requirements of Trellis changed over time, and they essentially changed out from under us. And that was compounded by the fact that we actually had the person who was maintaining the config generator Docker container actually left the company. So it got, like a lot of open source things, it kind of got left in the dust. And that was a problem on our part and for the community in general. And it needed to be maintained. It would have been nicer, to be honest, if that container, config generation container, would have kind of become part of Trellis. It would have been helpful for us anyway, such that when the configuration of Trellis got updated, it would have been updated in time. It didn't alleviate any of the problems that we ran into in terms, as I said, in terms of the restart and the workflows. And often, as I highlight here too, the solution to the problems was Charles help, right? Here are the flows, here's all the information, and Charles actually, and I think Saurav as well, developed, here, run these commands and send us this data as a tar file. And that helps. I mean, I don't want to minimize that. They were a big help. But from 100 people trying to use Trellis to 2 people that really understood it, it was a problem. As we continued on with Chord and XOS, it came to the point of discussions as to where the configuration for Trellis should be generated. And this was at the same time where we've seen age gaps, if you will, in the config generator. And it became a question of, should Trellis as a service, or Fabric as a service, be part of XOS such that when a new system gets onboarded in XOS, a host or a switch, XOS is informed, and that service then captures that information, regenerates the configuration, and pushes that to ONUS, or updates the segment routing application. Again, this is where I think, when I look at Chord as a whole picture, I think where you need to go. It gives us a controlled onboarding capability of new switches or new compute resources into the environment, and lets us control it in terms of, do we want to allow this switch in, right? It gives this flow around it. So I think in terms of maturing Trellis integration with XOS, that is a valuable characteristic. And I think that still needs to be pursued. I know at some point Andy was calling the config generator Docker container, or at least talked about it, I'll put it that way, in terms of XOS. But even for that, we noticed that didn't work completely, because often it was generate an initial configuration, then do some hand tweaking, and then that configuration could work with Trellis. Stability has continued to be a hit and miss. And this even goes back to, well, I got some other slides, so I won't talk about that now, but it happens today. And this is the biggest problem I have with Trellis, is how do I troubleshoot it? How do I get back into a running situation? We did have a break from Trellis in some sense, and I call this midlife really here, because we got to a point with Trellis, we could get it up and running typically, and then we could ignore it, which is actually the sweet spot in my mind for Trellis, right? It just works. And so we were actually quite happy with that. Then it broke. And we see this happens in terms of soaking, right? If I'm running Trellis for an hour for a test, that'll work. If I run Trellis for 2 weeks, it doesn't always come back. If I reboot a system, I have problems. So it became this 6-step or 7-step repeat process to get up and running. And the problem was, of course, that it didn't always work. I would do these steps once, it wouldn't work. I do these steps twice, it would work. And again, it's not necessarily an ONOS segment routing problem. It's a solution, system problem. And I'm not sure, and I'd be interested. I mean, I don't know how many people, when they're working with Trellis, are looking at it as that complete system. I know Saurav does, I know Charles does, but I think in the greater picture, a lot of, you're not thinking of it as the combination of everything. And often when you look at Chord, which is a major use of Trellis, Chord got tested without a real leaf spine fabric. And so Trellis didn't get really the workout it deserved as things went forward. And so we, Ciena, as well as some other people, were kind of the guinea pigs, kind of the testers. And while it's an okay position to be in, it can also be a frustrating position to be in when you're actually trying to accomplish another task, but Trellis is just a part of it. So recently, we took a step back from Chord intellectually, and we wanted to say, if we were to re-envision Chord on top of Kubernetes, how might that look, right? And so this was a step back a lot from the software side of Chord. We knew we wanted the physical pod, which means we knew we wanted the compute resources. We knew we wanted Trellis and the leaf spine fabric. Other than that, all bets were off. And so what we saw there is we still had the problem about Trellis configuration. And more importantly, when we did this focus, we wanted to focus on HA. So we had the problem about how do I get Trellis up and running again if one of my compute nodes fails, if one of my switches reboots? How do I get that up and running? We took some capabilities in terms of we took Onos and we said, okay, Onos is going to have to run in, well, cluster didn't really work right yet in a Kubernetes environment, so we'll run it in fast failover, which means it stops, we'll restart it. What we will have is another container that will be generating configuration based on information and pushing that to Onos and even kickstarting, well, we haven't got that part yet, but kickstarting the segment routing app if it needs it. The other thing we had to do is on the switches. We had to create a service for the switches, just a Linux service, not a big deal, that when the switch reboots, it will automatically try to reconnect to Onos. So we have this kind of HA infrastructure around that. And in theory, it should work, right? The switches come up, they should connect to Onos, and they do. In theory, Onos should come up with segment routing app, and it does. This other application is control of the configuration. It should generate a proper configuration and push it to Onos, and it does. But you reboot something, and it doesn't work. You don't have a segment routing framework. You don't have your routing. And we're back to that same problem of, okay, how do I troubleshoot why it doesn't work? Is the OFDPA agent got something that it's not forgetting or storing somewhere even on a reboot? And this can become a blocker and has become a blocker sometimes in our other development, trying to re-envision Chord on Kubernetes because, well, beyond wanting to use the fabric for the data path, the data plane, we also toyed with the idea of using that same fabric for the management plane after we get Kubernetes initially up. But we couldn't get the fabric up automatically, so we couldn't switch over there. The reactive programming we did, once we had the fabric up and running, Trellis up and running, the reactive programming we did, or Kent really did, worked, right? We could create layer 2 tunnels across the fabric. So we essentially have a situation where we're creating a VNF in a container, Docker container, and we're tying that through layer 2 tunnels across the fabric down to an OLT. So once you kind of get those things working, again, the fabric works. It happens to be on the events, the failure events, where we're running into a lot of problems, or the long-term running events. And so what I would like to see in Trellis going forward is really focus on some of those issues, really focus on how, as a mere user, a mere mortal, I can better troubleshoot Trellis. That might be, how do I, if I gave you a packet, if I gave Onos a packet or Trellis a packet, how might I see the flow rules that it traversed? So I don't have to go manually do the flow rules in Onos and walk through them one by one, right? Understand if Trellis is dropping a packet in some of the flows, which packet it's dropping. Just some insights so that we could understand a little better what's happening behind the scenes. A visualization would be wonderful. But in the end, I need to understand how the packets are traversing Trellis and the leaf spine fabric in order to really understand and troubleshoot my problems. My timer went away. I think I'm okay. I'm actually more than okay. So I talked a little bit about this already. This is just kind of the infrastructure we built around Trellis. And it does say to me that I think in terms of integration of Trellis into Chord, we're going to have to see some of these tools that we've built around our kind of re-envisioning of Chord also find its way into Chord proper, so that when switches start up, they automatically connect, such that when Onos starts up, it automatically gets a configuration for Trellis. Again, whether that's through XOS or through another mechanism, we've got to get to a point where Trellis really is just, it's a given, right? It's not something, how do I want to explain this? I'm not trying to solve the leaf spine fabric problem. We're trying to solve the how do I deploy a VNF chain problem. And what we're running into is we're solving the leaf spine fabric problem more often, or at least troubleshooting it more often than we are trying to solve the problem we're trying to solve. It's a great technology, but it's getting in our way a little bit, I guess is the best way to say it. So actually, I said 2 weeks ago we had this issue and ran into it unexplained. It's now been, what, a month, Kent, that it's been a problem? Literally, we had the fabric up and running on a known good config. It was all working. We were pinging from every compute node across the fabric to every compute node. And I got a Slack from Kent, and he basically said, it's not working. I've tried all the things that we normally try. It's not working. I said, fine. And I went and tried all the things we normally tried, and it wasn't working. And then that's when it becomes, hey, Charles, and help me, Charles, right? And to be fair, I owe Charles some files on this. But that's kind of I guess that's the experience that we've been having with Trellis. And I've been very repetitive on that because it's been very repetitive to me and very visible to me. The other thing that I just learned from Saurav about 2 weeks ago maybe is that DHCP was finally introduced into Trellis. And this has been a big issue again for Cord, because if you look at Cord today, when it deploys, it dynamically picks IP addresses for the compute nodes on the fabric interface, but it dynamically picks them all from one subnet, which simply doesn't work for Trellis. Each leaf has to be its own subnet. So essentially, Cord doesn't work out of the box until you manually configure your fabric interfaces on your compute nodes. With the introduction of DHCP into Trellis, Cord needs to use that. And I don't know if anybody, I haven't talked to Andy or Scott about this. I don't know if they have a roadmap plan to do it, but a compute node should be doing DHCP. It should be relayed by the leaf spine fabric with the subnet identification of which subnet it's for into a backend DHCP server. So the compute nodes get dynamically added to the network that way, the fabric interface that way. And then they should be routable through the fabric network. This needs to become an integral part of Cord. And if it's not on their roadmap, and I need to talk to Andy and Scott, if it's not in their roadmap, it should be. I think this is a great addition, and I'm very happy it's there, because we need to integrate that into our pod as well. But this is a great thing. So the takeaways, and again, a little bit repetitive here. Trellis represents, to me anyway, a really great network strategy. It gives you that flexibility for network growth, for network shrinkage, for redundancy in terms of dual homed stacks or racks. So it has that potential. It still has not reached that potential yet. And until it does, that fabric isn't ready for production. There's just no other way to put it. In terms of XOS, I think the leaf spine fabric Trellis is one fabric that a customer might deploy. In terms of XOS, the fabric Trellis versus something else needs to be an abstraction in XOS so that people can pick and choose which one it is. The takeaway, the troubleshooting tools, the debug tools just need to be there. If I had a call for anybody that wants to be involved in Trellis, my call would be, please build debugging tools, build troubleshooting tools. Talk to Charles, talk to Saurav. They have much better idea than I do what needs to be there, but offer your help for that. Because if I look at an operator trying to deploy this, even in a lab today, without Charles or Saurav, it's going to be a problem. They need those tools. And so my call for action would be, please donate time to that. And we talked about configuration should be mostly automated. There is some debate about that. I've always been on the side of discover what's on the network, hook it into the fabric. There is some legitimate security concerns about that, where they say, no, it should be an intentional connection to the fabric. And through XOS, I think you could do through policy, either one. And so that just needs to be implemented. But again, I want to get to a point with Trellis where it's there, it works, I don't have to think about it. Thank you.